Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. Suppose you're a basketball team and you're up by 100 points with 20 seconds left. How could you lose the game? Well, the answer is it's not that easy. You'd probably have to start a fight and refuse to take the court and things like that and get yourself forfeited, because you can't give the other team 100 points in 20 seconds unless, it's just not possible. You'd have to give them the game some other way. You could feed them all the three-pointers they wanted, and they couldn't make enough in 20 seconds to make up the deficit. So basically, when you're up by 100 points with 20 seconds left, the best thing to do is take out all your starters, make sure nobody gets hurt, and don't start a fight. That's not really true in tennis or baseball, which are not time sports, or even chess. So in baseball, your team could be up 100-0 with 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth. But if you walk the next 104 batters, then you're probably just losing the game. In tennis, you could be up in the best out of 5 sets. You could be up 2 sets to love with a 5-love lead and a 40-love lead in the game. But if you lose every point for the rest of the match, you're still going to lose the match. Chess is a lot more like tennis and a lot more like, golf and things like that, where you can actually throw everything away at the last second. You could be up 3 queens in the endgame and then stalemate your opponent. So there's only a few positions you could actually create where someone can't win no matter what. In other words, you could create a position that probably would not occur in a real game, where every move that white has is checkmate and there's no legal move that's not checkmate. It's possible to create such positions, but they never occur in games. In games, you can always throw away your win into a draw if you play badly enough. And of course, in a lot of positions, you can throw away a win into a loss if you play badly enough. So the question is, when you're up that far ahead, how can you possibly lose? And I decided there was no name for this. So I gave it a name, because giving things names like sneaky pins or hope chess or whatever helps people understand them and remember them. So I call the idea of taking an easy win and not winning by giving up a draw or getting checkmated or something, I call that a floobley. And I tell people, when you're way ahead, one of the things you want to do is think defense first. And that doesn't mean play passively. People confuse think defense first with play defensively, and as I've said in earlier videos, those two things are not at all the same thing. But what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, how could I possibly lose this game, and fix it so that can never happen. So let's take a look at this position here, and we'll look at a couple more. What would be a floobley that could happen in this position? Well, it doesn't take much to think about the fact that white could easily get back rank mated here. If he plays a move like rook a7, that allows the floobley rook d1 checkmate. So how could you not allow the floobley? Well, a lot of people like to push a pawn here, and pushing a pawn usually gets black to resign. If you play h3, then it's hard to envision how black could possibly win the game, because he can't back rank mate and he's down a whole queen for a pawn. So he's probably just going to lose. Is that better than playing g3? Well, maybe microscopically better. How could we envision white getting checkmated here? Well, I guess we could do it. Let's see if we can get white checkmated with some bad moves here. King to f5, rook to a7, king to g4, rook takes f7, king to h3, rook to f4, rook d1, checkmate. There we go, because the black king was able to guard the g2 square. So white was able to allow the floobley after g3. It wasn't very likely. Took some really bad play on white's part, but he did allow the floobley. Let's try to get a floobley after h3. How could we possibly lose? Well, I think we can set it up. How about rook f5, king f1, rook to c6, king to g7, king to e2, rook to c, we need another black move, h5, rook to c6, rook to f6, king to d2, allowing the floobley, rook takes f2 check, king e3, rook takes a2, and now black's up 2 pawns with a theoretical win. Well, because of this kind of floobbly, when I get to positions like this in games, I usually don't play h3, and I usually don't play, you know, king to f1 or something. I don't play queen a1 check. The problem with queen a1 check is this is a temporary solution to the problem. What I really want is a more permanent solution to the problem, if I can quote, Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical. We need a more permanent solution to the problem. So queen a1 check temporarily stops the back rank mate, but then my queen has to sit there on the back rank and watch the mate. So it's better to have a permanent solution by like h3. But what I usually play in these kind of positions to not allow any kind of flooblies, even if I lose my queen for a rook queen for nothing later, is to give up my queen for the rook right away. Now, of course, we have to go back and not pin the pawn, so the queen takes d5 is not a good move. So let's start with the rook on a7. Even with the rook on a7, where we don't have a sneaky pin, I still play queen takes d5 here. And when black plays e takes d5, I say to myself, now how could I lose the game? Well, I could lose the game if I fool around and I bring my king away and I try to bring my king up here and he brings his king up and I try to go after the pawns and maybe I go the wrong way and I say, oh, I better come back, and I try to cut off, and now it's really hard to lose this game for white, but rook here, and then I go, oh, I better stop that pawn, and he gets a queen. And I take it, and I go, oh no, I better save my pawns, and he comes after them, and I try to save them, and I can, and oops, now I'm losing. Okay, that was hard to do, but so after queen takes d5, e takes d5, I say, how can I lose the game now? Well, I can lose the game if he gets a queen. Otherwise, I really can't lose the game. His king can't come up and attack my pawns very easily. I've got all these squares guarded. So all I have to do is put my king in front of his pawn. Oops, maybe he doesn't want to play that. He'll lose the h pawn. So he plays here first, and I play here, and now he plays something like f6, and now I simply play king to d4. And now it's getting really hard to envision how I could lose the game. For instance, suppose I go after this pawn and black tries the famous three-pawn against three-pawn trick. G5, rook a5, f5, rook takes d5, f4, rook a5. I'm moving my rook as far away as possible so he can never remove the guard or anything. Rook here, pawn here, rook here, and black says, aha, I got you. Pawn here, pawn takes, pawn here, pawn takes, pawn here. Just if you haven't seen my video on king and three pawns against king and three pawns, it includes a lot more than what you just saw here. It's a really neat video. You might really enjoy it. But anyway, I call it king and three pawns against three pawns and much more. So anyway, can white still lose here? Well, he can, but it's really, really hard because it's hard for his rook not to realize this pawn is going to queen. And he can just come back to the first rank, and all of this black hope that he would get the pawn up and get a queen is completely dashed. Or I can put my rook behind the pawn. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. And it's really impossible to be losing here. So if I just do those two things, take the rook, and then bring my king in front of the pawn, if he goes there, I can take this pawn. He tries to go there, I go there, he tries to come up. As long as my king is anywhere on the d file, he can never zugzwang me away because I have a rook there. And the rest of the game just plays itself because I can zugzwang black's king away, but he can't zugzwang my king away. So I'm avoiding flooblies by playing a move like queen takes d5. Once I do that, the win's going to be really clear. Okay, what's the kind of floobly you can have when you have a king and a queen against a king? Well, what I teach people is when you have a king and a queen against a king, let's set up something like this. I tell them, move a knight, move away until the king goes in the corner, and then what you want to be is a large knight move away. 3 and 1 instead of 2 and 1. So queen here, king here, queen here, king here, queen here, king here, queen here, king h7, queen here, king here, and now I'm perfect. And now I want to bring up the king over this side, and I won't stalemate him. How could I not win this game? Well, I could move my queen up one more to g6 and keep going and knight move away. That would do it. Another way I see people do this is they play queen here and king here and queen f4 and king here and queen here and king here and queen here and king here. And now they stop. They say, all right, he's got to go between these two squares. I'm going to bring up my king and checkmate them. And the king goes g3, king g7, king g4, king h7, king g5, king here. And then they bring the king up like that, stalemate. That's why I tell people, don't put the queen on f6. That's a bad square. It's not bad in the sense that you're going to lose. It's just not the optimum way to do it. The best way to do it is when he goes king here, go a knight move away again, because the two best squares to mate on h8 are e7 and g5. That's a super knight move away from the corner. What do I mean by a super knight move? I mean 3-1 instead of 2-1. If you're 3-1 away, that means you've got a force field around the king. He's got the two squares he needs, or you need, so he doesn't get stalemated. And now you bring your king outside the box, and you won't stalemate him, and then you'll checkmate him. If you don't do that, if you leave your queen on f6, oops, that's another flooby right there, mouse slip. Queen here, queen f5, king here, king here. If you leave your queen there, it's much easier to stalemate him. And a stalemate would be the flooby here. Much more likely you're going to stalemate them than do the mouse slip thing that I just did and put your queen next to the king and get it taken off, although that can happen. By the way, if you're playing here on the ICC or on a lot of servers and you do those kind of mouse slips, when you're playing slow games, what you should do is go under Edit Settings and go under Playing and see where it says Drag Move here. You unclick Drag Move so you can't just drag a piece and let it go and it falls on the wrong square. If you turn off Drag Move, you have to click on the square you're coming from and then the square you're going to, and that way it's very, very difficult to do a mouse slip and get a flooby that way. Now, if you're playing a speed game, you can't do that because it's too slow. You have to put on Drag Move for speed games. But if you're one of those people that makes mouse slips and you're playing slow games, turn off the Drag Move. Now, that's on the ICC. Maybe you're playing on a different server. Maybe you're playing on Chess or Chess.com or Chessable or one of those guys. They probably have something similar. If they don't, you can check with the administrators or the helpers on that server and ask them, you know, how can I fix it so I can't accidentally let go of the piece on a square? And they'll tell you. So that's a way to avoid the online flooby, so to speak. All right, in my book, Everyone's Second Chess Book, I talk about a flooby. And let's set up the position. Let me get the book out. Everyone's Second Chess Book. And I have a game between my son when he was a youngster and his opponent way back at the World Open, back when my son was still a fairly beginning player. So let's clear out the board. Black had a king on g8, a pawn on g7, a pawn on f5, rook on c8. He had a knight on d4, pawn on a7, pawn on a2, wait, there's a pawn on g2, f2, h2, rook f1, king g1. Okay, so I was watching my son play the game from a distance away, and one of my students, who's named James, who was a little bit younger than my son, but he was a much better player at the time, James and I were watching the game. So I whispered to James, I said, Dellen's setting himself up to be checkmated. So I'm going to read to you what I wrote in the introduction to Everyone's Second Chess Book, second edition. I said, I was talking to one of my best students, James. James was 11 years old at the time, and his rating was almost up to 1800. We were at the 1996 World Open here in Philadelphia. The player playing white was my son, Dellen, one of the favorites in the always unpredictable under 1000 section. James smiled in disbelief because, unlike me, he hadn't seen Dellen commit self-mates countless times. Dellen is a smart kid, and at age 13 he had been playing tournament chess for 6 years, but just the fact that Dellen was still in the under 1000 section is enough to tell you he played just for fun and was not at all that interested in improving. And then I made a note and I said, with his friend's help leading the way, 3 years later, Dellen's rating peaked around 1800. So Dellen plays, guess I should give you the right position. Dellen has a rook on b7. So he's not losing, he's winning. Dellen's up the exchange and a pawn. All right, so Dellen's up the exchange and a pawn. What do you do when you're up the exchange and a pawn? Well, you'd like to trade rooks, so you could play rook on f1 to b1, threatening to play rook to b8, pinning the rook on c8 to the king on g8. Rook here, threatening to trade off the rooks. You could do that. You could also stop all these back rank mates. Well, what's the best way to do that? If you play f3, maybe the knight could get around and guard this pawn, but it still would be a good move. If you play g3, the knight on f3 isn't much of a threat because the king can always go to g2. But maybe the knight could go to a square that guards g2 and then mate you. But here, those three squares that he can guard are e3, f4, h4, maybe e1. And he can't easily guard g2, so g3 is pretty safe. h3 is very safe. The two squares the knight could go to hit h2 would be f3 and g4. I guess he could go to f1 in some lines. But it's going to be hard to get for Dellen to get checkmated if he does a move like this. All right, so what did Dellen play? Let's keep reading the book. And Dellen plays rook takes a7. So I write, Dellen plays the correct move, but I know from his previous pattern that his selection is a sign of trouble. One of my primary guidelines for my students is when you're winning, especially winning easily, you should think defense first. You don't have to win more. You should mainly make sure you won't draw or even lose. So there's nothing wrong with rook takes a7 as long as your next move in the next couple moves is something like h3 or f3 or something like that. So black plays rook to d8. Why does he play rook to d8? Because he's trying to say to himself, how can I set this up so that if white plays it really poorly, I can trick him and get back into the game? So black's move is very clever. What he wants white to do is maybe pin the knight so that he can play knight e2 check and set up the win of at least the exchange, if not more. So he's hoping that Dellen will see the pin and leave his king on g1, and then play rook to d1. So here, well, again, white should play maybe f3 or g3 or h3 or something like that. White plays rook to e1. I said, again, not really a bad move, but one indicative of the wrong frame of mind. What should white be thinking? He should be thinking, I'm up the exchange in 2 pawns, so if I remove all of black threats, I'm probably going to win. Therefore, in practice, the best move for a player like Dellen would be h3, removing all back rank threats. At least Dellen did not fall for the superficial good pin with rook to d1, when 2 knight e2 check king f1, rook takes d1 check king e2 would still win, though not nearly as easily. Okay, so white plays rook e1 and black plays knight e2 check. Is that a good move? Or is that a bad move? Or what is that kind of move? How should we annotate this move? Well, white has 3 legal moves. He can play king f1, he can play king h1, or he can play rook takes e2. Let's read what I said in the book. Knight e2 check. Black really has nothing to lose by playing this trap. You don't want to play silly traps when you're even or when you're ahead, because when you're even or ahead, then you could throw things away by playing silly moves like this. But when you're losing, you don't have a lot to lose, so you can afford to do stuff like this when you're losing. Now, I had taught my son Dellen to write his move down first before he makes the move. Put his pencil over the move, make a sanity check on the board, and then, only if this check passed, finally touch your piece to make a move. So what you should do is you look at the board, you come to your final move, you write it on your score sheet, assuming you're playing over the board, you put a pencil over your move so the other person can't see it, and you are allowed to write your move down first in most USCF tournament games. There is some tournaments where you're not allowed to do that. Then you make a sanity check. You say, is my move that I wrote down really crazy? What if I do that move? Can he just checkmate me or win my queen or just take off my pieces? If you do that here and your move is rook takes e2, then after you write it down and you do your sanity check and say, if I play rook takes e2, does that really make any sense? You would look for his checks captures, and threats. Well, how many checks, captures, and threats does he have after rook takes e2? He only has one. Rook d1 check. Is that any good for black? Well, yes, of course, it's a floobley that white has played rook takes e2, and black will win, so you cross off the move rook takes e2 and look for a better move. Okay, so in the book I wrote some of this Dellin did, but unfortunately his entire process to write his move, do the sanity check, and then make the move took about 3 seconds. And of course at the World Open you have 40 moves in 2 hours, followed by like game in an hour. So my son had a ton of time on his clock. He didn't have to play fast, he just did. This short time even included the sanity check, which consisted only of seeing if the knight was really unguarded. Well, yes, the knight is really unguarded, and white plays rook takes e2. Black plays rook d1 check, and white says checkmate. Well, it's not checkmate, but it's going to be. My son really didn't stop to look and see. My son's opponent said it was mate, and Dellin therefore put out his hand and resigned. As checkmate comes next move. James, my student, looked at me, trying not to smile. Dellin wasn't too upset, but as usual, his master dad was trying to avoid apoplexy. If I die of a heart attack before you read this, now you will know why. Well, I wrote this, 24 years ago, and I haven't died of a heart attack yet, but I'm sure eventually something like that. But if you're reading the book, luckily you'll see that I'm still alive. But this is allowing a floobley, and you just don't want to do these kind of things. There's many ways that you can allow flooblies. You can get your pieces trapped. You can get your queen trapped and allow a floobley and throw away a win. You can allow a back rank mate. You could let someone come up with a checkmate in a different way. Like, for instance, let's put up a different position here. Let's put up number 198. Would that be a good one? Just got to find my keyboard here. That would help. Okay, so here, how could black allow a floobley? It's black's turn. Well, if you're watching around the board and you're saying, how could I possibly lose this game? You might notice that the squares around your king are really weak, and that white pawn on f6 supports the g7 square. So if black does nothing here and makes a kind of a random move, the way to allow a floobley would be not to play rook c8 and allow queen takes c8 check, because most people would see that rook c8 is not safe. What they would do is quickly make a move like queen takes b5 and say, oh, that pawn's not guarded, I can safely take it. And then white will play queen to h6. Well, after queen h6, black's going to say, oh my, white's threatening checkmate. I guess if I'm a smart guy and I take my time, I should be able to figure out a way out of this. Well, unfortunately, that's a kind of hope chess. Hope chess is where you make a move and then your opponent makes a check, capture, threat, and then you hope that there's a way out of it. Well, in chess, it's fairly easy to generate unstoppable threats. And if your opponent's not very good and you generate an unstoppable threat, then no matter how long he thinks, no matter how good he becomes, he can hire, Stockfish and Magnus Carlsen to help him out. He could think for the next year with Stockfish and Magnus helping him here if he's black, and it won't do any good, no matter how smart he is, no matter how good he is, no matter how much time he takes, no matter how much help he gets, it's going to be checkmate for white on the next move. So this is really black not being careful and playing a move like queen takes b5, which is allowing the floobley, and white will now win with a move like queen h6. And as I said at the start of the video, chess isn't like, basketball or football, where if you have enough of a lead with little enough time left, you can't help but win no matter how stupid you do things. In my first article on Don't Allow the Floobly that I wrote for Novice Nook, I said, let's try to invent a floobly for football. Let's say if every player on both sides stands on their head and they all start singing, I don't know, what's a good song they can sing? How about the Howdy Doody song or something like that, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic? If they all stand on their head and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, then the game is immediately forfeited to the team playing, let's say, defense. All right, so if your team's on defense and you're down 100-0 with 30 seconds left, what should you do? Well, you should tell all your players to stand on their head and start singing Battle Hymn of the Republic and dare the offensive team to do it too and say, you guys are all chicken if you don't stand on your head and sing Battle Hymn of the Republic like us, because we can do it and we bet you can't. And the players playing on the offensive side say, oh, we're not chicken, we're going to do it too. And they all stand on their head and everybody sings Battle Hymn of the Republic. And immediately the referee throws his flag and says, I call this a floobley. The game is immediately forfeited to the defense. So even though the offensive team is up 100-0 with 30 seconds left, the defense now wins the game. Well, if you're a coach, you should tell your offensive team, no matter how much they taunt you, do not stand on your head and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, because even though we're up 100 points, we could lose the game. If you just fumble the ball or throw an interception or do something smart like that, we will certainly win because we're up 100-0. But if you stand on your head and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that's a floobley penalty and you'll lose the game. Well, you might laugh at my analogy, but this is exactly what happens with chess players when they get so far ahead and they think, oh, well, I'm ahead of rook. I can even get another pawn ahead, and that'll make it even easier to win, so obviously I should take this unguarded pawn here. That's how you lose flooblies. When you get far ahead, you don't need an extra pawn. If the computer already says you're up 16 pawns, going up 17 pawns isn't necessary. You can probably checkmate someone just by not allowing the floobley and trading off all the pieces and just winning with all that extra material you have anyway. You don't have to go around the board winning pawns being oblivious to what's happening. So here, black should be a lot more concerned with how white can back rank mate him on g7 than he should be concerned on how he can win a pawn. If you're more concerned about how white can get back in the game and not allow the floobley than you are with trying to win a white pawn, then you're probably well on your way to becoming a better player and not losing the game that way. If you want to see a game with a floobley in a video, I did a video last year called How Not to Play When Way Ahead. So if you haven't seen that video, I highly suggest you go to my channel Dan Heisman Chess, go back and look at the game How Not to Play When You're Way Ahead, where I talk about the things you do when you're way ahead and some of the things that you should be thinking about in more detail than what we did in today's video. Today's video just concentrated on one big thing, which is the floobley. Okay, hopefully you enjoy this. If you don't know what a floobley is, now you do. You can pass it along to your friends. I've now given a name to something that never had a name before. Don't allow the floobley. Okay, if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, we have about 140 good videos with more to come on how to get better at chess. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time then. Bye.